So, with the title that I've chosen for this talk, The Bullet, the Ballot, and the Boycott, people generally assume that I'm going to be speaking about boycotting Israel. But in fact, I'm not going to be speaking about boycotting Israel. I'm going to be speaking about Israel boycotting. Because I contend that Israel actually boycotts its own non-Jewish citizens in many facets of life. Let's talk about what is a boycott, first of all. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, we're talking about a withdrawal from social or commercial interaction or cooperation with a group. And I'd say that defines what we see in Israel. Now, we think of Israel, at least in the public imagination, as this place. We think of the kibbutzim, these socialist communes, this back to the land movement where people were forming agrarian collectives and farming the earth. And it was all those things, all for one, one for all, but only if you were Jewish. And if you were a Palestinian person living in the land and you also held socialist ideals and you also wanted to be part of this movement and you applied to join one of these agrarian communes, you were rejected outright and told, no, we only accept Jews. We boycott non-Jews. That's the kibbutz. Now, we move to villages and we see that the Israeli government boycotts non-Jewish Palestinian towns and villages, and it does not give the same kinds of funding that it does to Jewish towns and villages. So because of this, these towns can't expand. Clearly the population expands, people bring another generation into the world, and you need to build more houses, but the government doesn't allow these towns to expand. And so one family, at least, the Ka'adan family, Palestinian citizens of Israel, they said, well, I mean, Israel is ostensibly a democracy, so why can't we just buy a house in the next town over or in the next village? And so they did this. They applied for a permit to build a house in the next village, and they were told no. We only allow Jewish people to buy land and to build houses here. We boycott non-Jews. Now, this seemed to be an obvious case of discrimination, so the Ka'adan family took it to the court system and it actually went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court, the court asked the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, to respond to these charges of racism because in Israel, most of the land is actually either owned by the government or by quasi-state organizations like the Jewish National Fund. And so this is what the JNF had to say in response to these charges. It said, the JNF is not a public body that works for the benefit of all citizens of the state. The loyalty of the JNF is given to the Jewish people, and only to them is the JNF obligated. The JNF does not have a duty to practice equality towards all citizens of the state. Well, with this kind of response, the Supreme Court did find in favor of the Ka'adan family, said this is base discrimination, and they should be allowed to purchase land and to build a house in that village. That's good. But unfortunately, as so often happens with the Supreme Court, they lay down the law and they launder the worst excesses of the Knesset, and then the Knesset just comes up with another way to get around this new ruling. In fact, they passed a new law that they ceremoniously dubbed the Ka'adan loophole law. And so they did. They got around the law just saying, well, from now on, towns and villages across the country can refuse admittance, can restrict admission to Jews only. Well, as long as you don't say it's for racial reasons, as long as you say you don't fit the cultural profile, but you don't even have to explain what that is. You don't have to justify it. And as long as you just use this neutral language, towns and villages can continue to boycott non-Jewish people, people of color, queer people, whoever doesn't fit your idea of a cultural profile. But most often it affects Palestinian citizens of Israel. So that's kibbutzim, villages, and it happens in cities as well. And we have the town of Upper Nazareth. in the north of the country, and this is the mayor, Shimon Gafsel. Now, in Upper Nazareth, similar to the rest of the country, we're talking about maybe 80%, 75-80% Jewish population, about 20-25% Palestinian citizens of Israel. And so clearly, those Palestinian citizens of Israel want their children to learn Arabic. They want them to grow up speaking Arabic. It's their mother tongue. And they want to send them to an Arab language school. But the mayor refuses to allow the establishment of any Arabic language school in his town. And he justifies this in an op-ed piece he writes in Haaretz newspaper. He says, "Upper Nazareth is a Jewish city. I am a proud offshoot of a glorious dynasty of racists," he writes. And when he comes up for re-election, he actually campaigns on this basis. So he puts out posters proclaiming pride in this, hoping that other racists will vote for him on the basis of these policies. He writes there, "No more sticking to the law that allows any citizen to live wherever they want to." So there's no shame around it. There's no need to to couch this in euphemisms. It's just straight up racism, and it passes. It's acceptable in society. So we're talking about how non-Jewish people are boycotted in Israel on the basis of housing, kibbutzim, villages, towns, cities, new developments. So let's say you want to buy a house from a developer, and you see this pamphlet or this brochure, and you're enticed by it, looks attractive, and sure enough, you go through the 3D renderings and the photographs that they've included, and that's appealing to you, and you also want to buy a house in this new development. So sure enough, you call up the developer, and you want to make an appointment to see one of these apartments, but when you call, they hear that you have an Arabic accent, and so they say, "אבל אנחנו לא מוכרים לערבים, okay? But we do not sell to Arabs, okay?" And of course, you call 5 minutes later, or you get your Jewish friend to call up 5 minutes later, and he has a Hebrew accent, and he has a Hebrew name, and he lives in a Jewish village. And so then, of course, it's, "Oh, sure, no problem, come on down and get it." And of course, it's not that companies that do this then face some kind of censure. It's not that they're punished in any way. We continue as if it's all good. And so these developers of Givat HaOranim, here they are meeting, getting a hug from the Minister of Housing at that time, Uri Ariel, although it shouldn't shock anyone considering the previous public statements of Uri Ariel. He's gone on record as saying, "We must encourage Arabs to willingly leave, both from the cities and from the state." So this is how, in Israel, Palestinian people are boycotted on housing. Now you can see the full slide. Now, let's move to the labor market. So you can be walking down the street in Israel, and you can see a sign like this. It's altogether common. Of course, I'll translate it into English for your benefit. Jewish workers, plaster, paint, renovations. Now, if we were looking for a Torah scribe, I could understand why you would advertise the employee's Jewishness. But for plastering and painting, I don't think that there's any reason why you would necessarily need to seek out a Jewish worker. Of course, the idea here is they're trying to appeal to fellow racists, saying, if you don't want to spend a penny, to put a penny in a Palestinian pocket, then hire us, because we have only Jewish workers, and so you can ensure that every dime will only go to support Jewish families. This is the idea. And this is common in the country. Until a couple years ago, you could go through the Yellow Pages, right? Do they even still have that in the analog era? But you recall from back in the day, Yellow Pages, they would use words like these, avodah ivrit, and of course translated Jewish labor. It's kind of a euphemism, a coded language. The meaning is, we only hire Jews. So pay for our goods and services, and you can be sure that your money won't go to support Palestinian people. Of course, now we're in the internet era, so we have websites that collect all this information and tabulate it so that you can ensure that your racist dollars only go towards fellow Jews. Of course, we also have citizens' initiatives. So this is a photograph of the Machane Yehuda market. This is the largest market in Jerusalem. Hustling and bustling and lots of activity. And so what we have is a group of people going from, if you can imagine this, from stall to stall and from store to store. And in every one they ask, excuse me, do you have any Arabs working here? Do you have any Africans working here? Or are there only Jews in your employ? And once they verify who's working there, then they jot it down and they create a chart and they create an illustration and they publish this so that you will know which stores only hire Jews and which stores have non-Jewish workers, so you can do all your shopping and ensure that it only goes towards people of your own ethnic group. Now, I'm sad to say that it's just becoming more and more common to see this kind of activity. For example, this young man wrote on his Facebook page a while back, "The Arab sons of bitches, it's our duty to boycott every Arab business or product. I boycotted those shits even before." Nothing out of the ordinary about this particular young man, except that he happens to be the son of the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. So we see how the apple falls not far from the tree. So we've talked about housing and we've talked about labor, how Palestinian people are boycotted. Now we'll talk about recreation. So I don't need to tell you, down here in Louisiana, in the Middle East it gets hot. And in the summer especially, you want to go out, you want to take a dip in the pool. But if you live in one of those Palestinian villages and towns, you're being boycotted by the government, and so you don't get the same kind of funding, and so you don't have the money to build a public pool for the residents of your town. So comes the summer and you want to take your kids out, something to do, and you realize that, okay, it's a small country, so again, why shouldn't I be able to go over to the next town in one of these Jewish villages? Every one of these Jewish villages has public pools. It's only 10, 15-minute drive to the next town. So you get in the car, you call them up, and you ask them, can we come and visit your pool? We're happy to pay for the privilege. And they say, no, we only allow people from our own village to swim in the pool. And you call up village after village, and you get the same answer every time. Of course, 5 minutes later, your Jewish colleague calls them up, and they hear his accent, and they say, sure, no problem, we're open, ahlan wa sahlan, And this is how it goes. Admittedly, at least one of these places will allow Palestinian people to come swim, but then they'll charge them twice the amount for the privilege to do so. So it also extends to theme parks. Like I guess you'd have Six Flags here in the U.S. So people again work hard all week, want to take their kids out on the weekend, and get in the car and drive out there to Superland or whatever they call the Israeli version of Six Flags, and you get there and at the gate you're told, oh no, we don't allow Palestinian people in today. It's Jews only. But don't be offended because there's other days of the week that are Palestinian only. So that's somehow supposed to compensate for that. So this is how even in recreational facilities, Palestinian people are boycotted. Okay, we talked about housing, we talked about labor, we talked about recreation, and it extends also to political representation. Palestinian people's political representatives are boycotted. So here, this is a photograph that was published in an Israeli newspaper of a debate between political party leaders. So I know that here in the United States, you're still working with the two-party system. My condolences. With all of Israel's problems, and there's no small amount, I actually prefer this model where you have lots and lots of parties running in the election, so you have a diversity of views. And when it comes down to facing off in a candidates debate, there's lots of people, there's lots of participants rather, and so this is a photograph of one of these televised debates in the last election cycle, right? But the problem is this isn't the original photograph, okay? This is what was published in the newspaper, but this is the original photograph. Notice that in the original, there's another person in the photograph, that's Ayman Odeh, but the reason that the paper cut him out is because he is a Palestinian citizen of Israel, and he represents the Palestinian party in the Israeli Knesset. And so to them, he's not even a legitimate candidate. He's not even an option. We just cut him out altogether, Now, we go through the list and we see how the Israeli politicians from the other parties dismiss them outright and treat them with disrespect. So Yair Lapid, the so-called centrist, he so despises Hanin Zoabi, one of the Palestinian members of the Knesset, that when he speaks of the joint Arab list, when he speaks of the Palestinian members of the Knesset, he can't stand to even call them out by name. He says, I would never work with any of the Zoabis. And to him, they're all Zoabis. You know, this is essentially the equivalent. I don't know if you can see it all the way back there. I photoshopped her face onto. So, but this is basically the equivalent of a white congressperson or congressional representative calling all the African American representatives in the Congress, I would never work with any of those Leroys or something like that. It's completely racist, but this passes in Israel. This is considered, it's all good. So when these members of the Knesset want to have meetings with foreign diplomats who come to the country, that's their job, to have political meetings. And so the Speaker of the Knesset, Yuli Edelstein, forbids them from doing so, forbids these Palestinian members of Knesset from meeting with foreign diplomats unless there's a member of the government sitting in on their meetings, actually spying on their meetings and reporting back to the government. Because it's like they don't even have any real political, they're not even allowed to conduct legitimate political activity, So this is how they are just basically a fig leaf for Israel's democracy. Of course, Stav Shafir, the so-called social justice leader who's now in the Knesset, she is so afraid that anyone will see her talking to a Palestinian member of the Knesset. She doesn't want to be associated with them. Heaven forbid, that she lose the racist vote. And so she apparently won't even say hello to them. She'll just walk down the hall and act as if they're air, as if they don't even exist. She won't even nod and acknowledge their existence. They're not even humans in the same sphere as her. But when we go to the government, we see that of course it can get much worse than that. The Deputy Interior Minister in the Knesset itself, during a debate, he says to the Palestinian members of the Knesset, return your identity card. We are doing you people a favor by even allowing you to be seated here. Straight up. Now, of course, the former foreign minister of the country until just recently, Avigdor Lieberman, he takes it to the next level. The heads of the Nazi regime were executed. I hope this will be the fate of the Arab members of the Knesset. Yeah. This is what we're up against. This is how Palestinian people's representatives, political representatives, are boycotted. This is how Palestinian people are boycotted by the Israeli state and by increasingly large numbers of the Israeli population. Now, notice that in this entire discussion, I have not once mentioned the Nakba. I have not once mentioned the Nakba. I have not once mentioned the West Bank. I have not once mentioned Gaza. I have not once mentioned all the houses that were destroyed. I have not once mentioned 550 youth killed last summer. I have only been talking about what's happening inside pre-1967 Israel. Because there's this discourse, and maybe you've heard it here on campus or elsewhere, of liberal Zionists. And when the idea of boycotting Israel comes up, then they're quick to jump in and say, wait a minute, that's not fair. It's not fair to boycott Israel because if you're opposed to what Israel's doing in the territories, then you should boycott the territories. You should boycott the settlements. You should boycott goods and services that come out of the settlements. But don't boycott Israel. That's a separate entity altogether. Fine. In the West Bank, that's non-democratic Israel. But in the rest of the country, that's democratic Israel. Those are two separate entities. Now, of course, it's completely ridiculous. This is an artificial separation that has no basis in reality. It's one governing structure. It's one banking system. It's one army. It's one system of oppression that manifests differently in two separate areas, but it's the same system. It's the same people responsible. And so that doesn't fly with me. But let's assume for a second, let's run with that, okay? Let's assume that there are two separate entities called democratic Israel and non-democratic Israel. Well, everything I've shown you so far is in so-called democratic Israel, right? That's so-called democratic Israel where Palestinian people are boycotted, okay? So this is what I'm trying to explain to you, that Israel isn't a democracy, that in my mind it's an ethnocracy, and that the rights and privileges are not accorded to people on the basis of citizenship, but on the basis of their ethnicity. That's bad enough. And no one should have to live like that one more day. But what's even worse is that we see in recent years there are forces within the society that are trying to take that ethnocracy and turn it into a theocracy. I'll explain what I mean by that. We're going to look at some of these groups, and we're going to look at their goals and their strategies and their tactics. For some, an ethnocracy is not enough. There's these Jewish dominionist groups. And let's look at them. What they want is a theocracy. They want Israel to be a theocracy. The way to make it happen, their strategy is to ignite a race war. And when I say I ignite, I mean because their tactics are arson, burning, talking about burning trees, burning fields of Palestinian people, burning cars of Palestinian people, burning mosques, burning churches. And just in case you thought that perhaps this is just, some kids getting in a prank on, no. It's very specifically politically motivated, and you see this because they often leave at the scene of the crime graffiti explaining the reason for their actions. And keep in mind, this hostility towards Christian people and Christianity, Christians are only maybe 1 or 2% of the entire population of the country, all told. But even that small amount is considered a threat to these Jewish dominionists. Not only that, even schools where Jews and Arabs study together, and here I think it's important that I point out that 99% of schools in Israel are segregated. Okay? Israel has never had its Brown versus Board of Education moment. That 1954 Supreme Court decision officially desegregating schools in the U.S. I don't know how far we are from there, if it's light years or light minutes, but it's a huge problem because maybe 5 or 6 or 7 schools in the entire country are Jews and Palestinian people studying together. But even those few schools are so despised by these Jewish dominionists that they torch them, that they burn them. Grade 1 classroom, if you can imagine that. It was just last year in Jerusalem, the only school of its kind in Jerusalem. And now we have burning babies. We had a couple months ago in the village of Duma outside of Nablus, Jewish supremacists, thugs, terrorists who went into this village and firebombed, broke the windows, threw Molotov cocktails, and burnt an entire family. A mother, a father, and a 1-year-old baby, if you can imagine that. And this is what we've come to. These are people who want a theocracy, and they want a race war, and they want to make it come into being by burning babies. And again, it's not only that it happens, because surely there are crazy racist people in every society, but the problem is that they act with impunity. Okay? And so here you have Yuval Diskin, who until recently was the head of the Shin Bet, the Shabak, Israel's FBI. And talking about this very phenomenon, talking about Israeli or extremist Israeli hate crimes on Palestinian people and other non-Jewish people, he says, now and forever, there's been a total lack of will to tackle this issue at the political level. Okay? The Israeli security services, they're known the world over for their capabilities, but somehow they don't actually carry them out on these Jewish terrorists because there's no will. The politicians don't want it to happen. Those that actually did burn that school, they were caught, they were brought to court, they were sentenced to 2 years. As they were sentenced, they went out of the courtroom singing praises to Yahweh and telling the media it was worth it. Now, again, sad enough that this is the case, but what's more worrisome is that it's not thought of as being so insane, because when you ask average Israeli high school students what they think about this, I'm sad to say that a mere 28% of Jewish high school students were willing to outright condemn these hate attacks on Palestinian people. So, in other words, 72% of Jewish Israeli high schoolers were not willing to outright condemn these attacks. Now, again, I don't mean to suggest that that's 0%. I mean, there are still people who are disgusted that this would go on. And this man, for example, he's the mayor of a town in Israel. And after that most disgusting attack on the Dawabshe family, in which they were torched to death, he went onto Facebook. He felt it was time to say something. And he went to his constituents and he wrote, "Around us, we are seeing more and more displays of hatred and violence that make us all cringe. This is the time to remember the most important commandments. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Let's stop hating, and as it says in the book of Psalms, turn from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it." Well, I appreciate this politician, who was actually a right-wing politician in his town, that he went out of his way to say something. Unfortunately, this is the response that he got. The very next day, people torched his car. So this is the result of people having the gumption to actually speak out against these hate attacks. If this is what awaits them, if this is how they're responded to, think of what that does to the next person who is considering whether to speak out against these racist attacks.
Now I want to talk a little bit about these groups, these Jewish Dominionist groups. Let's start off with the ones whose motto was left behind at the scene of the crime. So at the Dawabshe family home, the arsonists, the murderers, left their calling card. They graffitied on the wall, "Yechid HaMelech HaMashiach, long live the King, the Messiah." Okay? Now this isn't a random phrase. It wasn't, they didn't come up with it from their own imagination. This is actually the motto of perhaps the most powerful, or at least one of the largest and most powerful Jewish religious sects in the world, Chabad. You may know of them here in Montreal. They may be operating on McGill campus. I can't say, I've only been here for a couple of hours, but certainly they're very active across the country and around the world. We see posters all over Israel, signs, graffiti, Yechid HaMelech HaMashiach. We go down to the US, we see that there's no small amount of political power that they've accrued over the decades. Here they are meeting with Ronald Reagan in the Oval Office going as far back as the 80s. George H.W. Bush, Clinton, George W. Bush, and Obama. Now when we look to the writings of the spiritual leader of Chabad, the messianic figure, Menachem Schneerson, and when we read the book of Atanya, which is like their religious manifesto, their foundational text, we see what they have to say about non-Jewish people. And they write, "The souls of the nations of the world emanate from unclean spheres which contain no good whatsoever. The Jewish body looks as if it were in substance similar to bodies of non-Jews, but the difference is so great that the bodies should be considered as completely different species." I'm no biologist, but I'm pretty sure I don't belong to the species Homo sapiens judaicus. I'm pretty positive we have the same DNA as everyone else in the room, but according to Chabad, we're different species. But they go on to say that even greater difference exists in regards to the soul. Two contrary types of soul exist. A non-Jewish soul comes from three satanic spheres, while the Jewish soul stems from holiness. Now, it's not only in the United States that they have political power, also in Israel when they meet with Netanyahu, he has on his skull cap, on his kippah, the same motto, Yechi Melech HaMashiach, but he isn't even their favorite political operative in Israel. They much prefer Netanyahu's challenger to the right, because also in Israel, there are internal elections in the different political parties, and the ruling Likud party, Netanyahu is challenged from the right consistently by Moshe Feiglin. This is someone who last summer, while death was raining down on Gaza, he went public with his opinion. The IDF, the Israeli army, shall designate certain open areas in which the civilian population will be concentrated. Subsequent to the elimination, Gaza will become part of Israel and will be populated by Jews. So open calls for ethnic cleansing. This is the man that the Chabad movement flies around the world. Here in Canada, down in Australia, we invite him to speak in their synagogues and community centers. Of course, we don't even need to go to the political realm. We can stay in the religious realm, because Chabad also has operatives in Israel, and their top Chabad rabbi, Yitzhak Ginsburg, he's famous for authorizing the King's Torah. I'll just say a couple words about this book if you haven't heard of it. Torat HaMelech. This is a book that came out a few years ago. It was published in Israel. And it's essentially, I'm sickened to say, it gives me no pleasure to report, it's essentially a Gentile murdering manual. It's a theological treatise in which this rabbi, a state-sponsored rabbi, I might add, on the public payroll, paid by my tax money, and he has a hypothesis. What circumstances is a Jew allowed to kill a non-Jew? This is the question that the book asks. And he comes to the conclusion that under pretty much any circumstance, he writes, there is justification for killing babies if it is clear they will grow up to harm us. He publishes this book, and Yitzhak Ginsburg, this top Chabad rabbi, is the one that gives it the asmachta, the seal of approval. He writes the introduction. He says, yes, this follows all the rules of halakha, of Jewish law. This complies with Jewish law and is an authoritative, source of wisdom. So this is the ideology that Chabad is putting its stamp of approval on. Killing babies. Okay? And then someone inspired by their ideology actually goes out and burns babies. Okay, this is what we've come to. Now my question is, why haven't you heard about this? Why are you hearing about this for the first time? Why do I have to come all the way over from Israel and explain this to you and burn up all these fossil fuels? Where is the mainstream media? Why don't you already know this? Why is no one criticizing Chabad? Chabad isn't criticizing itself. Since this happened, do you think that they looked inward and said, oh my goodness, people acted after being inspired by our writings, and they went out and they burned a baby, maybe we should rethink things? If you go to the Chabad websites, you'll see they don't even say, forget, maybe we need to look inward. They don't even acknowledge that Jews did it. Okay, even though they left the graffiti at the scene of the crime, on their websites, they're pushing a conspiracy theory that maybe it was Palestinian people themselves and that they forged this graffiti. Even the Israeli government acknowledges that it was Jewish supremacists who did it, but Chabad is so unwilling to even, examine its own role and culpability in this kind of, sickening murder that is willing to entertain these ideas of conspiracy. Now, I don't mean to suggest that this is all religious sects of Judaism. Far from it. In fact, that family, the Dawabsha family, with the mother, father, and the 1-year-old baby who were taken, there was a surviving member of the family, 9-year-old Ahmed, and at first it wasn't clear whether he was going to survive or not because he suffered burns in 90% of his body. But while his life lay in the balance, this man, a rabbi in Israel, the head of the Reform movement, a liberal stream of Judaism, the Reform movement in Israel, he actually organized an interfaith prayer session. He brought Muslim imams and Christian priests and himself a Jewish rabbi, and outside of the hospital where Ahmed Dawabsha was recovering from his wounds, they held a prayer session, a religious prayer session, and he spoke at that prayer session. He had something very interesting to say. He said, those doing price tag attacks, here he's referring to these racist hate crimes of Palestinians. Price tag is the euphemism used in Israel to describe these. So those doing price tag attacks are doing real Jewish acts, just as we are doing Jewish acts here by praying for the life of Ahmed Dawabshe. In the Jewish writings, you can find humanistic writings next to dark ideas, and the two are the two faces of Judaism. Until we understand this, we won't be able to fight for the leading voice of Judaism. It's not that those who carry out hate crimes are a distortion of Judaism and that we are the true Judaism. No, it is a struggle between two options of Judaism. So that's Chabad. Okay, now I'm going to talk about some of the other Jewish dominionist groups operating in Israel. We have the Jewish Home Party. This is a political party that is in the Knesset and is in the government itself. Yinon Magal, just in the last couple days, it's been exposed that he's a serial sexual harasser and sexual assaulter of women that worked under him. But in any case, talking about his racism as opposed to his sexism, among other things he says, the Arab nation, all it brings to the world is murder and blood. Now, the thing about Yinon Magal is he champions, he says, the right for Jews to pray on the Temple Mount. He says he's going to fight, in his words, for that right. Kind of casting himself as some kind of civil rights leader. Now, the thing is, there's this discourse in Israel. There are these groups that want to demolish the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, keep in mind, this is like, all of Palestine has been colonized. It's all under Jewish rule. This is like one little piece of land left that is still under some sense of Palestinian sovereignty, where Palestinian people actually have some measure of control over what goes on there. This little place that's the mosque compound. But Yinon Magal is supposedly saying, I'm not with those people that want to blow up the mosque and demolish it and build a Jewish temple on top of it. No, I'm just asking for a fight for the right of Jews to pray there. Well, I would have had an easier time believing you, Mr. Magal, if when you were announcing this determination to fight for that right, you didn't upload a selfie of you hugging up with the very terrorist who sat in jail for many years for plotting to blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Maybe I could have been sold on it a little easier if you hadn't uploaded that photo, but we see that this is the pattern of the Jewish Home Party, that they bring known terrorists into the halls of power to advise the government. This is their hallmark. So we move on in the Jewish Home Party. Ayelet Shaked, recently called Woman of the Year by Globes magazine, and of course you may know her as the woman who last summer wrote a Facebook post saying, "Who is the enemy? The Palestinian people are all enemy combatants." This also includes the mothers. So there's no such thing as a civilian. Men, women, children, old people, they're all combatants, they all deserve to die. It's a call for genocide. She then goes on to say, their blood shall be on their heads, nothing would be more just. And so Netanyahu then went ahead and made her justice minister, appropriately. So this woman, I see her once she goes to the justice ministry. I see her meeting with this man, this bearded man behind her. I wasn't really altogether sure about who he was, so I kept, pouring into it. And I see that also the head of the Jewish Home Party, Naftali Bennett, maybe you remember him from such statements as, "I've killed many Arabs in my life and there's no problem with that." But I see he also has been meeting with this man consistently over time, again and again. I see them photographed together all across the country, even in the halls of the Knesset itself. And so I had to do a little bit of digging, and it turns out that this man actually is a terrorist himself, a convicted terrorist. He and a group of others attempted to assassinate several Palestinian politicians, several mayors of Palestinian cities on a single day. In fact, this man, he was once the mayor of Nablus until those Jewish terrorists set off bombs and blew off his legs. And so this man, who sat in jail for these attempted assassinations, for mutilating this man for life, he is now an advisor to the Minister of Education in Israel. So I can rest assured that the youth are going to be instructed, on healthy values. So we've talked about Chabad, and we've talked about the Jewish Home Party. Well, now let's have a few words about a third Jewish dominionist group in Israel, Lehava. But probably the most prominent of the Jewish dominionists, beside the Jewish Home Party and the Chabad movement and others, is probably Lehava, or the followers of Meir Kahane, the founding father of Israeli fascism. So Lehava, if you can imagine this, they are an anti-miscegenationist movement. I have to parse that because some people may not have any idea what I'm talking about. Miscegenation is like a laundered term. It's a way that racists explain their racism, or when they oppose race mixing. A scientific way of saying that is you're against miscegenation. So these people patrol the streets of Israel, harassing and haranguing and assaulting mixed couples if they see Jewish people and Palestinian people coupling off, flirting and falling in love. Now, you'd think that they would be outliers, but no. In fact, they're brought into the Knesset, and not just by anyone, but by who have become Israel's top diplomats. On the left, we have Tzipi Hotovely, who is Israel's acting foreign minister. And on the right, we have Dani Danon, Israel's ambassador to the United Nations. So Israel's top diplomats, she invited them to come in, he hosted their meeting, and they are called in to be expert witnesses, to give expert testimony on this plague of miscegenation that's occurring in Israel, And I'll explain how it manifests in society. So this is Moab, a Jew, I wouldn't say a Jewish, I want to say an Israeli who is the daughter of Jewish citizens of Israel. And she fell in love with Mahmoud, who is the son of Muslim citizens of Israel. I don't say she's Jewish and he's Muslim, because who knows what they really feel in their hearts. I didn't quiz them on their spiritual inclinations. These are determined racially. It's because her parents were Jewish that she's called Jewish. It's because his parents were Muslim. And because of that, they're not allowed to marry in the state of Israel, because there's no such thing as civil marriage. And it's not accidental, it's on purpose. Because the state, although it cast out many of the ideas of Orthodox Judaism, it retained its opposition to intermarriage. And so there's no way that non-Jewish and non-Jewish people can get married within the state of Israel. If you have enough money, you can fly to some other country and bring your family there and then get married, at Berkeley City Hall, I guess, and then return, and it's a fait accompli. But there's no way you can do that in Israel, and so that's a disincentive. And so in any case, at their wedding, if you can imagine this, and I was there and I documented this, and it's online, you can check it out on my YouTube channel, you actually had the Lehava group inviting their activists from all around the country to protest the wedding. And on their wedding day, you had hundreds of Jewish Israelis screaming "Death to the Arabs," chanting "Death to the Arabs" outside the wedding hall. This is Israel 2015. Now, bad enough that this exists, okay? But what's worse is that they also have received state funding. So in recent years, they've received up to the equivalent of $166,000 from the Israeli government. And I'm sad to say, the American people also play a small role in this, because there are charities here that operate with tax exemption, and they've raised $234,000 in a year that go to the sister organization of Lehava to pay for the legal representation, because sometimes, on occasion, when they attack in the case, for example, of that Jewish Arab school that was torched, that was done by members of Lehava. And when they were taken to court, they had legal representation. Their legal fees were provided by this group that is funded in part by donations that are tax exempt, thanks to the American taxpayer like yourself. So
the leader of Lehava, Bentzi Gopstein, he was asked straight up, because, no beating around the bush here, are you in favor of burning churches in the land of Israel, yes or no? They were clearly the prime suspects when people saw that these churches were being torched, and he said straight up, no shame around it, yes, you have to burn, yes, of course. Simply ask, why are you even asking? You have any doubt? So there's not much of an effort to conceal the game plan here. Now you have to ask yourself, why isn't this reported in the mainstream media? Why do I have to fly all the way over here from Israel and burn all these fossil fuels to tell you this? Are there no other journalists that are capable of reading and writing and speaking fluent Hebrew and English simultaneously? No one? I find that hard to believe. And so, Bentzi Gopstein, the leader of Lehava, the group, their slogan, their motto is Kahana Tzadak, or Kahana was right. Again, a reference to the founding father of Israeli fascism, Meir Kahana, and he was actually a member of the Knesset back in the 1980s. The same shtick, same kinds of props that he'd use. Now, Kahana, at the time, his views were actually perceived to be beyond the pale, over the top, disgusting even by the standards of the Israeli right wing. So when he came to Knesset and made his racist proposals, you had a member of the ruling Likud party, Netanyahu's own party, Michael Eitan in this case. He challenged Kahana in the Knesset, and he called him out. He said, you are no different in many ways than Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, he said, on the Knesset floor. He said, let's break it down. Let's make a comparison. Let's look at what you've proposed and what Hitler carried out. Kahana called to cancel the Camp David peace treaty. Hitler wanted to cancel the Versailles peace treaty. Kahana wanted to make the Communist Party illegal, just as it happened in Germany. He wanted to make it illegal to sell non-kosher food in Israel, just as Hitler made it illegal to sell kosher food. He said that non-Jews should not be allowed to live in Jerusalem, just as the Nazis made it illegal for Jews to live in Berlin or Munich. He wanted to make it impossible for non-Jews to vote or hold public office in Israel, just as the Nazis forbade Jews from voting or holding public office in Nazi Germany. He wanted to make it impossible for Jews and non-Jews to study in school together, the same thing in Nazi Germany. Kahana wanted to make it impossible and illegal for Jews and non-Jews to swim. Same with the Nazis. And of course, the classic, he wanted to make it illegal for Jews and non-Jews to marry or even to have sex with one another, just as the Nazis did. So, that's the 1980s. At that point, this ideology was considered so disgusting that even Israel's right wing was, repulsed by it. But today, Kahana no longer exists in the flesh. He's passed on, but he's become an icon, and he has legions of followers who can say how large his followers are. But what's certain is that he does have popularity. You go around the country, you'll see graffiti all the time. Kahana Tzadak, Kahana was right, and we see that his visage, his face, has been iconified, and it's not uncommon to see people wearing the slogan Kahana Tzadak and his face on their clothes. Now, anyone can say what they want to. It's free speech. That's all fine and good. But today, those ideas are no longer marginal. You have even Israel's Minister of Culture, Miri Regev. She doesn't have a problem posing with someone who's clearly wearing and talking about Kahanist ideas. All right, it's no longer shameful to be associated with the ideas of Meir Kahana, that even a minister in the government doesn't mind taking a selfie with a Kahanist supporter. Proudly so. Now, as I said, Kahana's dead, but his message lives on in his own grandson. His grandson is also no small terrorist in his own right. He's one of the leading ideologues or activists of the Jewish dominionists. But let's be honest, he has help. Now, a few years back, he was playing cat and mouse with the Israeli army. The Israeli army was trying to prevent the expansion of the settlement. Expansion was happening all the time, but it wasn't happening fast enough for the Jewish dominionists. And they resented this, so they actually were attacking elements of the Israeli army itself to prevent the withdrawal from a settlement. And so as he and his friends are attacking army outposts and army vehicles, you have this man actually sending him text messages explaining to him where the army units are going to be so that they can easily evade their patrols and get away clean. Well, how did this man happen to know where the army was going to be? It just so happens it's not just an average citizen. We're talking about someone who's now a minister in the government, someone who at that time was the Likud party whip and the government whip, the coalition whip, Ze'ev Elkin. He was giving him messages telling him how to evade. I mean, in other countries this would be called treason, but he continues to serve and it has since been promoted. So this is the political culture. And talk about the Dawabshe family. What will happen? It's been months since that family was burnt, since they were put in the ground. Will we see any justice? Will Israeli forces find the perpetrators of this heinous crime? Apparently, according to Israel's defense minister, they know who did it. But he says that although they know who's responsible, they have chosen to prevent legal recourse to protect the identity of the sources, if you can imagine this. You feel me? So they know who did it, but because they have spies among these Jewish supremacist terrorists, and they want to continue having them in position and informing the government of what's going on in their ranks, they want to continue to have access to that information, so they would prefer not to expose their secret agents. And because of that, the Dawabshe family will never see justice, and the murders will go unpunished. So this is the level of justice that Palestinian people can expect in Israel. This is bad enough that you have Lehava with the government not doing much about it, essentially patrolling towns and cities in Israel and harassing and attacking mixed couples wherever they can be found. So if that wasn't bad enough, that the government does what it can to prevent interracial marriage, so-called, we see that they are now expanding their sites across the Atlantic, and so now this is the new face of evil, right? This is the enemy now. This is the failure. This is a failure that needs to be corrected according to the Israeli government, not because he established Facebook, but because he chose to marry a non-Jewish woman. So it's not bad enough that the government fights miscegenation, so-called, in Israel itself, but they're now exporting this model abroad to try to shame mixed couples. Okay? Now, Michael Oren, Israel's ambassador to the United States until a few years ago, and now he's actually serving in the Israeli Knesset, so-called centrist party. And Michael Oren, he says about Jews who are married to non-Jews, he says they have a hard time understanding the Israeli character, because I guess the moment a circumcised penis enters a non-Jewish vagina, they automatically lose 20 IQ points. This is his proposal, I guess. I'm sorry we're not as smart as you, Michael Oren. Only the pure-blooded, the pure racial people can possibly have intellectual prowess. And it's not only him, of course. We also have other centrist politicians like Elazar Stern, who writes an op-ed in the Jerusalem Post saying that Israel and the United States share a concern about intermarriage. Intermarriage is all too real in Israel. This is the eugenics program that it's not bad enough that they're trying to prevent in Israel, but they also want to prevent it outside of Israel. And so the government agencies spend money to conduct campaigns here in the US to convince Israelis living abroad and Jews living abroad over 50% of young Jews outside of Israel marry non-Jews and are lost to us. That's it. You're lost to us. You're cut off from us. And so instead of seeing this couple as, a symbol of success, a Jewish man marrying the son, the daughter of the emperor and empress of the American Empire, so we see them as, again, being something that must be fought at all costs. And last year we have the Israeli government, if you can imagine this, spending $4 million to prevent interracial, interreligious marriages here, not in Israel. Okay, $4 million to send emissaries around the world to convince Jews not to marry non-Jews. All right? Now, that's last year. This year, the government has decided to ramp up that figure to $50 million. This is my tax money. Okay? Welcome to my reality. Now, I showed you the example of the Jewish citizen, the Palestinian citizen who coupled off, but increasingly we're also talking about mixed marriages between white Israelis and African refugees. I should say something about this. Admittedly, if I was a racist person or more racist, then, I would also feel threatened. Some fine-looking Sudanese and Eritrean men and women, and all of a sudden these people come to the country, I'd be like, oh man, I gotta step up my game, I gotta look good now, I gotta stiff competition. But, putting that aside, these are, whatever your feelings, these are people who fled horrific dictatorships. We're talking about coming mainly from Sudan and Eritrea. This man, the head of state of Sudan, he's up on war crimes charges at the International Criminal Court for the ethnic cleansings in Darfur. We talk about Eritrea, it's somewhat less known, but we're talking about a country that has never had a democratic election in its entire history. They've been ruled by the same person for decades upon decades. In fact, 63% of the population of the country has only ever known life under his rule. Okay? And people are fleeing in every direction. We see that there's 50 million refugees in the world today. That's more than there's ever been since World War II. And they're going everywhere, here in the US and Australia and Europe, but also to Israel. Israel, need I remind you, is in Africa. Okay? Israel is in Northeast Africa. And it's the only land bridge between Africa and Asia. And so it's only normal that people would flee there as well. But when they arrive, the government doesn't want to give them any help, and it also won't allow them to work legally so that they can sustain themselves. The idea is to make their lives miserable. That's the official wording of the Israeli Interior Minister. The idea is, we're not going to deport you ourselves, we're going to make your lives miserable until you self-deport. Then you can't blame us for it afterwards. Then you can't go to the world and complain about it. So people come, and since they're not allowed to work, endemic poverty across the board, people living in very cramped conditions, tent to a room, but at least let's give them that. They no longer have the sword of Damocles hanging above their heads, and they've survived. If it's ethnic cleansing or outright slavery, they now have some safe space where they can breathe, and I'll say that much in the defense, but the government quickly builds a fence along the border, shutting off Africa. So at this point, starting in 2013, the fence is completed, and then there's no more African immigration to Israel. So the 66,000 people who made it in, up until then, that's it. You would think the government would have said, okay, no more African immigrants, a mere 66,000, less than 1% of the population, what's it to us? But no, that's not enough. So the government starts demanding that people renew their papers every 6 months, every 3 months, every 2 months, every 1 month, people standing in the streets, sleeping on the ground, and then you have the police officers rounding people up. Just anytime you see a group of black people together, the security officers will come up on them and start carding them, saying, show me your documents, are you Jewish, aren't you Jewish, can you prove it? And if you don't have papers proving that you're a Jewish citizen of Israel, and you don't have, so then you can just quickly, easily be rounded up. Wherever they know that black people are going to be, that they'll pounce it like this is a party. And one of these Sudanese refugees actually, passed a course, took some kind of educational course, and so he invited all his friends, and
So the government busted it up. This is a pretty standard tactic. But also, it doesn't even need to go to any party. You could just be walking down the street in downtown Tel Aviv, okay? And they'll just be looking for African people, and then they'll round them up, and then they'll take them down to these desert detention centers. And as you can see, there's nothing to do and there's nowhere to go. It's just sand in every direction and surrounded by a firing range. And admittedly, they have furloughs in the daytime, so they're allowed to walk around, do a circle around the camp, but that's about it. You can't really get anywhere because there's no population centers or anything to do. They're isolated, and the idea, again, make their lives miserable, so they agree to self-deport. And it works. Because if this is your fate, if this is what you have to look forward to for the rest of your life, you too will probably come to the conclusion, better to die in my own home country than in some random country, and live in this desert detention center for the rest of my life, held against my will. So people take the government up on its offer and they agree to self-deport. But, at least the government should have done basic, minimal amount of efforts to ensure that these people would then go off to countries in which they would receive refugee rights. Okay, Israel, you don't want any of these non-white, non-Jews? Fine, but at least, do some diplomatic dealing and ensure that these people, when they leave the country, are going to find some other country in which their refugee rights will be respected. But no, we see that 68% of those Africans that Israel pushed out the country were sent right back to Sudan and Eritrea, the same countries, the horrors that they fled from. Of the rest, the 32%, we see that even those countries they sent them to, they didn't receive any refugee rights there, and within just a few days, they then dispersed to all manner of countries from Scandinavia in the north to South Africa in the south. That there was no effort to secure refugee rights for them in any way, shape, or form, to the point where a few months ago, we actually have some of those refugees kicked out of Israel, ended up being rounded up by ISIS. So, kicked out of Israel because they weren't Jews, and then executed by ISIS because they weren't Muslims. Now, we've seen lots of photos of these people trying to cross the Mediterranean, just crawling onto the beach with their last breath, lots of bodies drowning. There was one incident last year where a whole boat went to the bottom of the Mediterranean and we had 1,000 bodies, 1,000 people died in one day from a boat of refugees crossing the Mediterranean. You would think when these images, hit the screen and at least, it causes someone to, with half a heart, to look inward and think, goodness, what have we done? What have we come to? What could we do? How could we do different? But according to Israel's Minister of Transportation, Israel Katz, this is a reason for joy. This is a reason to receive a compliment. He says, after those refugees drowned, see how correct the government policy was? You can give us a compliment. So he's proud of his efforts to drive out Africans and ensure that none will reach Israel's shores. But admittedly, it's not only in Israel where we see this nativist sentiment. Okay? If you open up the Daily Mail, a British newspaper, you'll see all kinds of articles. How many more can we take? Too many migrants. Enough is enough. The swarm on our streets. Okay, this isn't a shock. If we look at the Daily Mail going back to 1938, you'll see they said the same thing about Jewish refugees fleeing the Holocaust. Sickeningly, they wrote in 1938, the way stateless Jews from Germany are pouring in from every port in this country is an outrage. So, okay, we have a long history of nativism, not only in Israel, here in the United States, the same thing. I mean, on the eve of World War II, when people were fleeing the Holocaust, people were polled here in the U.S., and 53% of Americans polled said that Jews are different and that their immigration should be restricted. Okay? Now, when I look at these photographs of these African refugees in Israel, I see a lot of striking parallels, and that's why it's an incredibly difficult issue for me emotionally, because it just strikes too close to home. It's just too similar to our story, to our collective story. In the cases, not of all of us, because at least half of Jewish Israelis hail from, Muslim countries and Arab countries, but for those whose ancestors came from Europe, this is a story that's just too similar. And it also affects my own family. You see, the government of Israel does not call them refugees. It also doesn't call them asylum seekers or even migrants. The Israeli government calls these people infiltrators. And this is the most sickening part of all, that not only do they experience the same thing, but even the demonizing discourse used to delegitimize them is the same. So just as these African refugees are called infiltrators by the Israeli government, you see that at the end of the Holocaust, those Jewish refugees who managed to survive the war, then when they're trying to flee Europe, are called infiltrees. And it's the same concept. This is how it breaks down. I'll explain it to you. So, without going into too much detail, my own grandparents, my mother's parents survived barely, saw their families slaughtered in front of them and were the only surviving members of their family and survived the war. And then at the end of the war, my grandfather goes back to the village he grew up in, and the locals see that he survived, but aren't interested in him staying there and threaten him that if he doesn't leave that they'll attack him. So he realizes that even though the war is over, that there's no point in him staying there, and he decides to move to North America. But he's living in Poland. He's in Poland. There's no port in Poland on which he can board a boat to come to North America. So he has to cross several national borders in order to get to a country with a port at which he can board a boat to come to America. Well, that makes him an infiltree, because an infiltree is someone a Holocaust survivor who crossed more than one border in order to get to a safe space. So this word was used to describe these refugees, okay? And now the government uses the same concept. It says that because these refugees from Sudan and Eritrea crossed through Egypt in order to get to Israel, they are not real refugees. They are infiltrators. So sickeningly, by Netanyahu's standards, my own grandparents fleeing the Holocaust would have been refused. And not only them. But this is a reality, that with this insightful language, that the Netanyahu government has turned the population against the African people. And so we have firebombing. Just as firebombing Palestinian families, we have firebombing African families, firebombing their apartments, even if you can imagine this firebombing an African kindergarten in Tel Aviv. And of course, the stabbing attacks. We even had this family standing in downtown Tel Aviv, a mother, father, a young child, and a baby in her mother's arms, and a Jewish man comes up and stabs the black baby in her head, the 1-year-old baby. Now, obviously, anyone who stabs a baby is a complete psycho. You can't compare that to any average Israeli, but why did he choose to stab a black baby and then tell the police, I did it because black babies are terrorists? Okay? Because this is the result of Netanyahu's incitement campaign against Africans for years. These are the fruits of his labor. Just to bring people up to speed, I know some people here have actually been following this story for a while, so just to let you know what's been happening the last few weeks. As I mentioned earlier, the Supreme Court, its role is to launder the worst excesses of the government, and so it stepped in this case as well. It said, you're on no solid ground here. These people have done no wrong. They've committed no crime. You can't hold them in jail indefinitely. You have to release them after a year at most. So, with this ruling, the Israeli government, in fact, released 1,000 plus of these refugees from its detention center. But when it did so, it said, now you can't live in Tel Aviv or Eilat. These are now sundown towns. So the only two cities where they actually have friends and family, any support system, the government says you can't live there. So what are they going to do? So they step out the detention center and they're looking for where to go, and they board buses. But when they start spreading out all over the country and on one day have to decide where they're going, you see Israeli mayors actually stepping up and running with this policy. So This is the mayor of Arad, and he writes on his Facebook, "I won't allow infiltrators to reach Arad. I ordered city police to augment forces at the entrance to town. I call upon everyone to be watchful. I won't hesitate to call on all residents to fight." To fight. And sure enough, he posts police at the entrance to town to prevent African people from entering. Okay, and this is also adopted by other mayors like Rafi Ben Shitrit of Bet She'an. When I talk about Africans in Israel, anti-African racism in Israel, sometimes what comes up for some people is, well, how can you talk about racism against African people if there's African people in Israel? There's African Jews, there's black Jews. How can Israel be racist or anti-black if there's black Jews? And they brought these black Jews out of Africa not to be slaves, but to be free from slavery or to be liberated. And so doesn't that kind of screw up your narrative? So let's talk about African black ants. I'm actually happy to say that this is a story I just broke today, published in a Nigerian journal, Ventures Africa, so it's like a world exclusive, and you're the first people to hear about it since the article's been published. So, Operation African Walnuts, what is this? So we know that, just as the Israeli government says, it's true, this part of the story is true. The government did send planes into Ethiopia. They loaded up those planes with Jewish people, and those Jewish people were brought to Israel, and since that time, they've all been living, they and their descendants have been living in Israel as ostensibly citizens of the state, with all that implies. Now, the question you should be asking when you see these photographs is, why are they in color? Because all the other Jewish groups in Israel immigrated much earlier. Israel was established in 1948. Within just a few years, the Jews of Iraq, the Jews of Yemen, Jews from all over the world streamed into Israel. You know, the state facilitated the immigration of Jewish communities throughout the world, including countries with which it had no political relations with. So why is it that it took decades to bring the only community or recognized community of sub-Saharan African Jews, of black Jews? Why did that take decades? Well, what the Israeli government says in this case is they said, well, the political conditions of the time did not allow for it. Well, I have a problem with that statement, because I did some digging and I found out that in fact, 10 years previous, I mean, it was the 1980s when those Ethiopian Jews were brought to Israel, but a full decade earlier, 1972, the Israeli government did something very, very similar. Just as in the case of those Jews, they took a plane, a Hercules jumbo jet, Israeli Air Force, flew into Ethiopia, landed in the Afari desert region of Ethiopia, and once they got there, they brought Ethiopians on board and flew them back to Israel, and they and their descendants have been living in Israel ever since. But those Ethiopians that they brought on board were not Ethiopian Jews. Who were they? Well, what were they is the actual question that needs to be asked. They were actually Ethiopian donkeys. Now, why would the Israeli government bring Ethiopian donkeys to Israel? Why would the Israeli government spend $500,000 to purchase 12 Ethiopian donkeys? Well, because of this man. This man was, I guess, an Israeli kind of a pioneer of the conservation movement in Israel. And he had this vision, he had this idea that if we could establish a nature reserve in Israel and we could bring back to life those animals that existed in the time of the Bible, if we go through the Torah and the Talmud and we see the names of the various species, and if we could somehow restore the flora and fauna of the time of the Bible and make the country look as it did in biblical times, then it would reinforce the Zionist narrative. And then that would give more credence to the idea that Jewish people, just as in days of old, that they should rule the land. And so this was a project that the Israeli government approved and the Israeli Air Force approved, and so they actually brought these donkeys to Israel, and I visited them down in the desert, and they and their descendants are living there till this day, frolicking on the flats there. And but what does this teach us? It teaches us that the government was perfectly capable of sending jets in and bringing Ethiopians back to Israel if they so chose, when they wanted to, when it was politically expedient to do so. But they didn't do so with the Jews of Ethiopia until the 80s. Why? Well, we easily understand this from the writings of the Israeli ambassador to Ethiopia at the time. This is Hanani Noe, the Israeli ambassador to Ethiopia. Here he is giving his exactly with his which
credentials.
Yes, he's handing in his credentials, he's presenting his credentials to Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, and he's officially taking on the tasks of ambassador. And he writes to his fellow Israeli ambassadors that if they were to allow Ethiopian Jews to visit Israel, it would raise hopes of immigrating for thousands of primitive, illiterate, sick, oppressed people will never have capacity for. Okay? The Israeli government did not want Ethiopian Jews to come to Israel because they were Ethiopians, because they were black, because they were from the so-called third world, developing nations, but especially because they were African. And so, at that time, if you were an Ethiopian Christian, and you wanted to come on a pilgrimage to Israel, you want to see the holy sites, walk where Jesus walked, no problem. You come to the embassy in Addis Ababa, bam, get your stamp on your passport, there you are off on the next plane. However, if you were an Ethiopian Jew, and you wanted to come to Israel and visit the holy sites and see where Moses or Joshua or whatnot walked, then you said, okay, well, we'll give you a visa, but it's going to cost you $600, which, of course, it goes without saying, was beyond the means of any Ethiopian at that time, Jewish, Christian, or otherwise. So, in this way, the state of Israel prevented Jewish people from Ethiopia from even visiting the country because they didn't want them to come because they were afraid that they would stay. They didn't want them to stay. They didn't want them in the country because they were black, and so they prevented them from doing so, and that's why none of them came. Now, I think that pretty much dispels this PR Hasbara line of Israel can't be racist because of Ethiopian Jews. The last kind of nail in the coffin is the people who did so. The reason why Israel finally changed its mind was not because of any internal realization that it had been wrong all this time. It was because of the persistent efforts of Americans. Actually, American Jews started up these groups, and they petitioned and they pestered, and they really didn't let up. For years and years, they bothered the Israeli government trying to convince them to allow Ethiopian Jews to bring them to Israel. Now, admittedly, they were partially motivated by humanistic concerns, but it must also be said, and we see this from their own writings, they weren't bashful about it. The reason, one of their main motives for trying to convince the Israeli government to bring these Ethiopians is because at that time, this is the 1970s, right? So the United Nations passes a resolution declaring that Zionism is a form of racism. That the regime in Israel, as I explained at the beginning, is racist. It boycotts its own non-Jewish citizens. So the state is racist, and the UN General Assembly proclaims this, that Zionism is a form of racism. And these American Jewish groups, who they themselves were Zionists, they wanted to protect Israel. They wanted to help its public image, and so they thought that if they brought black Jews to Israel, then they would be able to dispel and shrug off these accusations that Israel was a racist state. And so, at least in part, that's why they lobbied the Israeli government to allow the Ethiopians. They eventually did, but we see that even the initial immigration to Israel of Ethiopians was based on a policy of blackwashing from the very beginning. And
it must be said, Ethiopian Israeli people aren't stupid. They realize this, they understand this, they know this, they're not dumb. And so you have recently, after a viral video came out of police officers beating in Ethiopia, now this is a representation of it, but the video, of course, is pretty horrible, but it didn't really need much to kick off these protests because pretty much every Ethiopian man in Israel can tell you either a personal experience or something that happened to their brother or cousin or uncle. Everyone's got a story of police brutality. And this moment was like Israel's Trayvon Martin or its Black Lives Matter moment. And so earlier this year we saw Ethiopian Israelis in the streets protesting, demanding an end to state racism and police brutalities against the community. And you had people protesting in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv, blocking 10 lanes of traffic in Israel's largest artery, the Ayalon Highway. It was pretty impressive, especially when you saw the constituency that came out. It was multi-gender and multi-generational. You had old and young people coming out, which is no small thing. Unfortunately, the protest against police brutality was met with police brutalities much greater than that which regular old, if white Israelis are protesting, they have to face far less severe police presence and policing, but these protests were dispersed with great violence, of course. So maybe not akin to what Palestinian people have to experience, it must be said, but certainly more than what white Israeli protesters experienced. And in the aftermath, people were demanding some kind of government accounting for what had happened, but since then we see that the government says that the police handled it impeccably, and that's the Justice Ministry. And then, of course, police services, when called to look into these complaints, they said an in-depth analysis of all the complaints revealed no evidence of discrimination or rights violations. So the struggle continues. Ethiopian people in Israel still struggling, demanding an end to state-sponsored racism against them, but we're not really making any headway, especially when the sole Ethiopian Israeli member of the Knesset himself is such a sellout that he actually voted against. He didn't vote for a state inquiry into these allegations of state racism against Ethiopian people. I mean, it shouldn't have been a shocker. He's a close ally of Netanyahu and Naftali Bennett. But pretty sad that the only African Israeli member of the Knesset would actually vote against an inquiry.
So we've talked about Israel can't be racist because there's black Jews. If we're already at it, why don't we discuss the other common refrain we hear batted around a lot, which is Israel can't be racist because there are gay Jews. Right? I'm sure you've heard this. Well, let's have a look at that, shall we? So, okay, again, admittedly, let's admit that this is true. It's definitely not all over Israel, okay? But at least in Tel Aviv, or let's be more accurate, at least in some neighborhoods of Tel Aviv, yes, you can walk down the street holding hand with your same-sex partner. That part is true. Yes, there are pride parades. But in liberal Tel Aviv, you can also have people spray paint outside your home, fuck gays, kill gays and Arabs, because they want to drive you out of a Tel Aviv neighborhood because they don't like the fact that you're queer. Okay, this also happens in liberal Tel Aviv. Also happening in liberal Tel Aviv is gunmen driving by the gay community center and spraying it with bullets and killing young Israelis. Till this day, we don't know who killed them. The government has never indicted anyone for these murders. In fact, not only those who were murdered, but those who were wounded and who have since been in wheelchairs, the government isn't even willing to pay for their wheelchairs. They're left on their own to fend for themselves because our queer lives only matter if they can be used for hasbara. On their own, they don't matter to the government. And this is the perfect example of this. So this is a photograph of this past year's 2015 Pride Parade in Tel Aviv. Now, you see those wearing blue shirts are actually ministers in the Israeli government, Ofir Akunis and Miri Regev. Now, this is how ridiculous the situation is. This is Friday. Pride Parade's held on Friday. The next day, Saturday, the Sabbath, everything's closed. The following day, Sunday, is a work day in Israel. Back to work. The government's in session. There's a vote on whether to extend protection, to gay people, to queer people, because, so at least on the books, there's a law saying you can't fire someone, you can't deny someone a job, or can't deny someone an apartment on the basis of their race or religion. So there's a vote to extend this legal prohibition against discrimination to gender preference and identity. And those two ministers who were very happy to come to Gay Pride Parade because they know that gay people vote and they know that gay people buy stuff, so they're happy to come out and to try to appeal to them to win their votes so they can amass political power. But when it comes time to using that political power to actually standing in solidarity with queer people, they aren't even willing to do that. Even the most basic thing, that people don't deserve to be fired from their job because they're queer, even that they wouldn't stand by. That's how garbage their solidarity is. Of course, we see that Netanyahu has some kind of a penchant for nominating some of the worst homophobes to the government. We see the last deputy speaker of the Knesset, Moshe Feiglin, he comes out with an op-ed piece in the Jerusalem Post, "I am a proud homophobe." No need to read between the lines here, right? I don't need to parse that. But then that's in the previous government. In the current Netanyahu government, we have a new deputy speaker of the Knesset, Bezalel Smotrich. He's essentially Israel's equivalent to Rick Santorum, with everything that implies. Now, Bezalel Smotrich, remember, he's from the Jewish Home Party. This is the party that brings in the terrorists into the halls of power. But in his case, he doesn't have to bring anyone else. He just comes in himself. Because he himself, this is a mugshot from a few years back. He never was indicted over it, but he was brought in for questioning because when they were considering evacuating one of these settlement outposts, he was actually found in his home massive amounts of fertilizer. We don't know exactly what he was going to bomb, but so he himself has an illustrious past, but now he's a legislator in the Jewish Home Party. And that, among other things, he organizes an anti-pride protest, okay, a homophobic protest that they call the Beast Parade. So they will take donkeys and other farm animals, and then when some of these queer kids finally find the courage to come out of the closet and to walk down the street, proud of who they are, but instead of giving them their space, he decides he wants to make them feel like garbage. So he gets together these farm animals and he leads them in front of the Pride Parade, and he calls it the Beast Parade, the Abomination Parade. And so what happens, he's essentially calling for biblical injunctions against them. We all know what the Bible says has to happen to homosexual people, right? That they need to be killed. So this is essentially his response, and he's brought into the government, and he is appointed deputy speaker of the Knesset. And this is the result of Netanyahu's choices. So this year at the Jerusalem Pride Parade, we have this man. It's all on video. He gets out his knife, and he actually stabs people at the Pride Parade. And he murdered this girl, this 16-year-old girl. That's bad enough. But it isn't just one person's actions. Okay, this man who was caught for stabbing the girl, he did the exact same thing 10 years ago. The same exact person. He went to the Jerusalem Pride Parade. He stabs people in the streets. Of course, he's caught. He's brought to trial. He's convicted. He's sent to jail. A few months ago, he's released from jail. Okay? Doesn't express any regret over this. The day before, or 2 days before the Pride Parade, this new Pride Parade, he writes a long article expressing essentially his intention to do pretty much the exact same thing over, and he publishes this, and all you need to do is put one person on him. If you suspect in any way that maybe he might go there again, just have one police officer just monitoring his activities, following him around to make sure he doesn't take it there. But our lives don't matter. Our queer lives don't matter unless they can be used for hasbara. And so what did the police do on that day? Instead of sending someone to just watch this man, they had massive amounts of forces instead at the wedding of two of the richest people in Israel, the son and daughter of the owner of the biggest bank in Israel and the owner of half of Israel's gas fields. They're, marrying their fortunes together. And so the police, of course, want to have their hands close to the purse strings. So they send, massive amounts of their forces to attend the wedding of these captains of industry. Because that's more important than protecting our queer lives, even the ABCs of police work. And we see that in the weeks that follow these homophobic murders, it's not that the religious right all of a sudden had a revelation and realized, what have we done? Maybe we need to look at, how we got to this place. No. We see that the chief rabbi of Jerusalem comes out saying about queerness, this phenomenon will wane and disappear because most of the public is disgusted by it and detests it. We see that the top newsletter in Israel targeting the religious national youth, that they write in an op-ed piece, fight back and stop giving in to LGBT terror, or humanity will send itself back to the Dark Ages. This is how they respond to the murder of a young girl. LGBT terror. And you walk down the streets of Jerusalem and you see, in those days following the murder, you see these signs on the city streets. Bless you, Rabbi Yishai, that's the name of the stabber. You have done an act of Phineas. And he took a pike, killed the whores. Now here I need to parse that because not everyone here may be as well versed in Bible texts. So the story of Phineas, again, all you need to do is open up your Torah, English, Hebrew, it doesn't matter. You go to the book of Numbers, chapter 25, and you read about this story. So what is the reference to Phineas? Why do they call this man Phineas? According to the Bible, Phineas was a zealot, priest of the Israelites. And when he learned, just like Lehava, when he learned that there were Israelites and non-Israelites who were falling in love and coupling off, he was so incensed by this, he was so disgusted by this, that he came upon a couple, and in the middle of lovemaking, he stabbed them. He took a spear, and he skewered them both, murdering and mutilating them both in the act of lovemaking. Okay, this isn't the Bible story. This is Phineas. Now, so that's bad enough that Phineas is held up to be a hero. And these people are saying, you, Shlisel, Yishai Shlisel, by stabbing this girl at the Pride Parade, you have done a noble act of Phineas. That's the Bible version. Okay, that's bad enough. Then you go to the Talmud, and you read what the Talmud has to say about Phineas. And you see that it says, miracles were done for Phineas. His aim was through the penis of the man and the vagina of the woman. Are you getting this? So the Talmud is saying that Phineas is a hero. Yahweh decided to do a miracle for him. That miracle was that when he went to murder this man and woman, that his aim was true, and he actually skewered the intertwined genitals of this couple in the middle of making love. I mean, this is some human centipede type shit. This is sick. And this is the discourse in the religious right. And again, in the days that followed, we don't have government officials, recalcitrant or wondering how this happened. The left-wing legislators call for a discourse and debate because this murder of Shira Banki at the Pride Parade happened just hours after they burned the Dawabsha family in Duma, the mother, father, and one-year-old baby, within just hours of each other. When these racist and homophobic attacks happened, then they said, let's just have some kind of Knesset, conversation about how we got to this point and where we need to go next. But no, the government boycotts it and doesn't even bother to show up for the debate, because that's how little our queer lives matter. Now, with all of these racist and homophobic attacks going on, the issue, again, is not these sick bastards who are committing the attacks. The issue is who is laying the fertile ground for them to operate in.
Right?
right? Because the question is, if this is how bad as it is there anything that we can do? What can those Jewish Israelis who object to this rabid racism, what can we do? The problem is that we are so marginalized and so few in number that we have no real power in the country. And this is how we are thought of and how we are spoken of in the religious discourse, in the right-wing racist discourse. So we are called Erev Av, or mixed multitude. I don't expect you to know what that is. It's a biblical reference. But if you open your Bibles up to Exodus and you read about the story of the Exodus from Egypt, it says there that it wasn't only Jewish people or wasn't only Israelites who left, but in fact there were a few other people who joined up with them. People who felt solidarity with them or who felt some affinity with them and decided to join up with the Israelites and leave Egypt with them. Now, when we think about people who left their own group and joined forces with a marginalized people and in solidarity with oppressed groups, right? We think of, for example, John Brown breaking into Harper's Ferry, trying to steal weapons in order to disperse amongst slaves in order to ignite a slave rebellion, right? We think of him, or we like to think of him, I hope, as a hero, right? Or when we think about, for example, those Jews and Palestinians who left Palestine in the 30s to go to Spain to fight against Franco and the fascists in solidarity with the Spanish people, we think of them as good people, as people who went beyond the bounds of their cultural group to show solidarity with an oppressed group, you know? But that's not how we are seen in our own culture, in our own society. And in fact, we're not seen as Jews who are naive, and so we're willing to fall for anything. This is not how we are painted. We, in fact, are not painted that way, but as race infiltrators. They say of us that we are that group Erev Rav. We are not real Jews. We somehow snuck in and joined up with the Jewish people in order to live with them, but in fact, we are of a different race. We've infiltrated into their race, and now we are trying to steer them in the wrong direction. Now this is what the Torah says about us, okay? But what the Talmud says about us, again, is even worse. And so, according to the Talmud, all humans are descendants of Adam and Eve, right? But us Erev Rav, we are the descendants, according to the Talmud, we are the descendants of Samael and Lilith. We are the descendants of the archangel of death and of succubus. So we are essentially, us leftist Jews, we are considered to be demons. Now, the truth is, I'm not really insulted. I think that's kind of high. I'm not really put off by that insult. But clearly, they mean it in order to literally demonize us. Very literally, to demonize us. To delegitimize us. And they've succeeded in this. Because we have no power, no real power in the country. And so you can't look to us to pull Israel out of this pit it's fallen into. Okay? It's on y'all. Okay? We need support from outside. We need our voices to be augmented. Palestinian people fighting for freedom and Jewish Israelis fighting in solidarity with them, speaking out in solidarity. We need y'all here outside the country to augment these voices. And if there's one thing I'll say to close it up, it's that I really resent that this people who for so long championed scholarship and who for so many people they symbolize, you know, the holding education to be a cherished value. But instead, we see that today we are dumbing ourselves down and we are trying to dumb others down. And we are trying to bully people into believing that there's only two options, and if you don't believe one, then you must believe the other. And either you must insist that Jews deserve territory that they control, or if you don't subscribe to Zionism and don't believe Jews deserve to control the land, then you, by definition, believe that Jews deserve to die. And so you're evil, and so you're beyond the pale. This is this disgusting false binary that has been foisted onto the discourse here. And I'm here to demolish it.
Okay, enough is enough. Any person with 2 brain cells to rub together knows that there's a third option. Jews deserve the same rights as persons, as people. I don't want any more rights than you, and I don't want any less rights than you. I want the same. I want to be a citizen plus or citizen minus. I just want to be equal. And you have that in this country, and it may be an incredibly imperfect system, and there is so much work left to do here and in other parts of the world. But just as you, at least on paper, are said to have equal rights, I believe that I deserve no less. So we're living in a country that's ruled by the bullet. And we want to get to the place where we settle our differences with the ballot. And how are we going to get there? Is the boycott going to be the tool that brings us there? Well, I'm not going to talk about that too much. That is something that needs to go on in your communities. But I will walk away with just one more final thought. And that's because people often turn to me and they say, "Good God, you depressed me. You talked about nothing but horrific stuff for the last 2 hours, and now I want to slit my wrists, and can you at least say something good? Do you have any hope?" So I just wanted to, it's actually quite difficult, to be honest, to come up with something that fills my heart with, the belief that things could get better on their own, because it feels like it's getting worse. But if I'm asked, I thought of this incident that occurred in the Knesset a few months ago. I'll just share it with you. And that's in the government's efforts to rule out Palestinian political leadership, to drive them all out of the Knesset, it's raised the bar necessary to get into the Knesset. If until then you had to have this much votes, they raised it to this much votes, knowing that the Palestinian parties only get around this much votes, so hoping that by raising the round, it would essentially keep them out of the Knesset. Well, they didn't succeed, because then in response all the Palestinian parties united to form one big super party, and they were able to get into the Knesset that way. But in any case, in the government's efforts to kick out all the Palestinian people from the Knesset, they've forgotten that it's not only Palestinians who would be affected by this new rule, but there are ultra-Orthodox parties in the Knesset that are also quite small, and by increasing the number of votes you need to get in, they were also essentially threatening these parties with being kicked out of the Knesset. So you had one of these rare moments where all of a sudden the shared interests of these two groups that don't have a lot in common, all of a sudden they conflated with one another. And so they played this out in the Knesset. The Israel Eichler of one of these ultra-Orthodox parties, he went up to the podium of the Knesset, to the dais, and he said, if you can imagine this, in Arabic, although in a little bit in broken Arabic, but in Arabic he said, "We are with you in your struggle for democracy." And of course, not to be outdone, after he got off the dais, then Ahmed Tibi of one of these Palestinian parties, he rose up to the Knesset, to the dais rather, and then he responded, if you can imagine this, in Yiddish, and responded in Yiddish, saying, "In the name of the Arabs, I thank you for your support for democracy." I personally don't intend to vote for either one of these people. I have a bit of a different vision, not a Muslim vision or a Jewish vision or a religious vision at all. My vision for what I would like to see made manifest in the country is more of a secular variety. But what I mean to suggest is that if we can at least live in a country where this is how we speak to our political opponents, where we agree to disagree respectfully, where we see each other as equals, and we may not always agree, but at least we'll hash it out in a democratic debate. If we can get to that point, then I'll be happy. I feel that would be a sign that we've reached the other side. We've crossed the Rubicon. So thank you so much for your patience and for caring and for listening to all these stories, and I hope that you'll take them with you after you.